Hey everybody, welcome to this evening's Be Ready to Play coaching webinar. I'd like to welcome everybody back on this lovely evening. Hope you're enjoying the Be Ready to Play program over the last number of weeks with the sports science webinars. We've been having the coaching webinars and also the athletic development program, which is on the e-learning portal that can be accessed. So this is the Be Ready to Play program partnered with by UPMC. So we're really looking forward to this evening's coaching webinar, and we hope you are too. So we are joined tonight by our two colleagues. We have Anne Dwyer and we have Richard Bowles. Anne has played camogie and ladies football since a young age. Like many others, she is involved as an underage coach with her camogie club, Éire Óg in Anacarty, County Tipperary, for many years. Richard has coached at club and county level for many years, and is also a coach developer with the LGFA and also the GAA. He is currently coaching with his own club in Ula in County Limerick. Both Anne and Richard work as teacher educators in the Mary Immaculate College in Limerick and have coached the college ladies football team since 2016. So tonight's web presentation, we'll be looking at Richard and Anne will be discussing some of their experiences of coaching together during this time. And tonight's topic is coach reflection and player-centered coaching, the implications for players and coaches. So we welcome everybody. In the background, I have my colleagues, James Heffernan and Carl Craig, and also we'll be joined later on by Des Ryan, who will give us an update on what's going on over the coming weeks in relation to the Be Ready to Play program in partnership with UPMC. So, Richard, without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, thanks. Thanks very much, William, for your introduction, and we're delighted to be here tonight as part of the Be Ready to Play webinar series. Just to extend on where we're coming from, my involvement with the Mary Immaculate College ladies football has been since 2016, and this has really been my first involvement of adults coaching. And I was delighted when Richard asked me to join, as he'd been coaching this team for more than 10 years previous to this. And over the past 5 years, we've learned a lot from each other, even though we both have different levels of coaching experience. And this working together kind of led us to research our own practice. And in tonight's presentation, we'll focus on two aspects of what we've learned. The practice of shared coach reflection helped us to better understand how a player-centered coaching approach could be used in our coaching, and also coaching together helped and informed our coaching outside of the Mary Immaculate College coaching. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we want to focus on the process of coach reflection and how it can be used to help understand and implement a player-centered approach to coaching. So perhaps for those of you that are listening or watching from home, maybe if you have a piece of paper nearby, it might be a nice idea just before we begin to note two things if you want. So just for yourself. So firstly, if you are a coach, maybe to think about how you are reflecting on your own practice already. And secondly, whether you're a coach or a player, when you hear the phrase player-centered coaching, what kind of words come to mind? So maybe if you just want to make note of them for yourself at the moment, and we might come back in and check with them again a little later in the webinar.
Okay, while you're jotting down some of those ideas, I'll move on to our next slide. And I suppose to start this piece, I'd like to say we don't have all the answers, but what we do want to do is share our experiences and see how they might be relevant for your own coaching or indeed playing contexts. And to give a background, some of you may be aware over the last number of months that the GAA, the LGFA and the Camogie Association have designed and produced this player pathway with kind of 6 key elements on it. So club being core, connection, being inclusive, having as many players involved for as long as possible in the best environment possible, and players being player-centered, and the idea of having quality coaching experiences is a really important part of that framework that covers everything from foundation level, which is your underage players up to about 10 or 12, and then your your foundation level 3, which looks at club, then going to the elite and performance and talent development levels. So across all the spectrum, from the very start to adult performance at all sorts of levels, the pathway addresses that. And I suppose for us, how we connect this pathway is how we'll talk a little bit about being player-centered, and how we'll talk as well about giving quality coaching experiences, or talking from our experiences, how we tried to work on our own coaching, to try and be player-centered and to try and provide those quality coaching experiences as best we can. Sometimes I think we succeeded, and I think sometimes we'd be honest to say that sometimes we did not succeed either. So we'll explore some of those things over the next while. So that brings me to thinking a little bit about coach reflection as a concept. And over the slide here, we're going to look at that why is reflection important, what might it look like, and then how. What have we tried over the last number of years? Some of you may be familiar with the concept of coach reflection. I suppose to take a step back, to be a coach or indeed a player, lots of factors go into how we prepare teams or how we prepare to play. So things like skill and tactical development, fitness, movement skills, social and psychological skills, diet and nutrition, the list goes on. Each of them are important in their own ways as we're trying to put together a very large jigsaw. And for us, though, reflecting as coaches can help each of those factors, but probably not all at the same time. And it gives us an opportunity to think about what we're doing as coaches as we try and develop those different aspects of playing the games. Many of you may have heard Wade Gilbert speaking at the GAA coaching conference back in 2017, and the quote we've included here goes back to some of his earlier work, where he talks about with Pierre Trudel that 10 years of coaching without reflection is simply 1 year of coaching repeated 10 times. And that really resonated with us. So it kind of gives us a rationale for why it's important to reflect on our coaching. So maybe we don't make the same mistakes over and over again, so that we can build on the good things we're doing and constantly evolve how we are as coaches, whether it's coaching with the college team, as William introduced there, but also in our own contexts where we're coaching at club level, at all age groups from under 10, perhaps up to adult level. So in our experiences as coaches and as players indeed, very often, particularly after a loss, in the dressing room, people will talk about what went wrong, and very often it's, oh, we weren't fit enough. And that may be seen as the solution to all the team's problems. To us, that's a kind of a superficial reflection. And as we began talking and coaching together, we wanted to go a little bit more, to look more deeply at all aspects of our coaching and hopefully become better coaches as a result. So the what, I suppose we would, having looked at and bought into the idea of it's important to reflect, then we began thinking about what we would reflect on. And I suppose we would think about, sometimes people may look at match statistics to help them to reflect on a performance. They may look at other indicators like that. But for us, we were also interested in looking at how we coached ourselves, so our specific performance as coaches. And we become aware of the term player-centered coaching or athlete-centered coaching, which was used nationally and internationally. And I work in the area of PE teacher education, so I would have been aware of it from that as well. And we were intrigued to try and find out a little bit more about what athlete-centered coaching or player-centered coaching might look like trying it out in practice. And I suppose that was our what. We wanted to see, could we coach in a more player-centered way? The American writer on coaching, Doug Lemoff, uses a quote that says, when you chase 5 rabbits, you're likely to end up catching none. I think that's a really good analogy for when we start our reflections, to be specific and to focus on maybe 1 or 2 key parts of our coaching rather than trying to sort out everything in the one go. So being specific would be something that we would advocate. Look at one aspect of your coaching. And then the how aspect. So over the next while, we'll talk about some of the things we tried, some of the things that worked and didn't work, and then try and connect those to player-centered coaching as well. So very often we started off thinking about organizational issues. So things like picking a team organising groups or drills within training, or tactical things. But we wanted to look at to structure our reflections to challenge maybe and even change our own practice. So we did spend a lot of time talking about organizational issues when we talked, but we also tried to focus on our own coaching and what we were doing well, and to figure out if we were being player-centered. So that brings me to some of the practical things that we did. So the structure for our reflection as time went on. So reflection can be an individual activity, it's something we might do ourselves, or it could be shared practice, which is what Anne and myself would have worked on over the last number of years. So in most settings, coaches don't work alone. So then involving somebody else in shared discussion can be really helpful to help us to learn and to improve. So that other person, maybe somebody you're coaching with, or perhaps somebody not directly involved in your coaching, but somebody you trust and you know who can give an input. For example, in our shared coaching in Mary Immaculate College, we sought to hear from other more experienced coachings in other settings. So we talked to people who were experts in being player-centered in other sports. We talked with William Harmon here to give us some insights from a ladies football perspective. And in particular, two colleagues in MIC took on the role of reading our weekly reflections, the things we were writing on a weekly basis, and giving us some feedback at different points during the seasons. And each of those different interactions with other people prompted us to look at different aspects of our coaching. So how you choose to reflect, I suppose, depends on your choice in many ways. So for us, we shared written reflections with each other each week. So we wrote them up in a Word document and emailed them to each other, and had a look at what we'd written and gave each other some feedback. Now, for me, I love writing an open reflection. So taking out a Word document or a piece of paper and just writing freely for as long as I have thoughts to put down. Anne, on the other hand, would much prefer a structured kind of bullet point approach to reflection. So that just in that example shows there are so many different ways of reflecting. A good starting point might be to keep a coaching diary. So a small notebook perhaps, or maybe an app on your phone that you can write quick notes on before you forget them. I tend to use the Notes app sometimes to note those kind of things that I read about, that I hear, or just thoughts that come into my head when I'm on the go, and maybe come back to them later. Some people feel they reflect better when they write. Others prefer to talk through it. So making an audio note on your phone, even while you're driving home from training, while things are fresh in your mind, can be a useful strategy. So I would think work with whatever works for you in your own setting and your own lifestyle. But one thing we would certainly advocate is, can you consider working with someone else to help you to guide your reflections? Because sometimes I find when we reflect on our own, we can be very often too critical, or maybe not notice some important things that happened in a training session or in a match. So Anne might take on this now from here and maybe describe how we reflected together.
Yeah, as we coach together and work together, we both had different levels of coaching experience, and this was evident also in our reflections. I suppose my reflections as the novice coach were more focused on organizational type things and planning my specific coaching cues or questions. In comparison, Richard's reflections as the more experienced coach, they were often more focused on like the players' participation and the players' learning. So for example, if it was during a small-sided game, I would be more concerned about timing, the intervals, the breaks, the organizational aspect of it, while Richard reflected more perhaps on how the players were communicating to each other during the game. It's important also when we're talking about reflection and shared reflection is to acknowledge that like reflecting together does require trust, and that we develop that trust and honesty over time. At first we were probably too nice to each other when we were reading each other's reflections and giving feedback to each other about our coaching. Very often just noting the positive in each other's practices. And it was only in conversation, as Richard mentioned there, with other coaches about our shared reflection process that we were really prompted to offer more critique to each other in our feedback. And really when we started doing that, you could see that it did really improve the quality of our learning and the value of the shared reflection. And I suppose in terms of reflection, you can think of a strategy that we used was to consider hot and cold reflections. So even if we think of, yourself as a coach, many of us can relate to like the informal chats that a coach might have, with your other coaches, setting up or tidying up after a training session, or in the car park after a session. We could spend an hour chatting about a previous session or a game the previous weekend. So very often our perspectives change when we chat with our fellow coaches, and our perspectives can also change over time. Many of us as players or as coaches, we feel the need to identify something or a reason immediately after a game to identify or rationalize the result or the performance. And that type of immediate, like on the spot reflection, we kind of refer to that as our hot reflection moments. Whereas if you take time, we all know reflecting on things the day after or a week later, we might cast some different light on the same situation. And that really is in terms of our cold reflection. So when we allow that time, sometimes we can get a deeper understanding, and then that can better help to improve, our coaching going forward. So there certainly are benefits of that kind of hot and cold reflection in our practice. So just on the next slide then here, we're just going to share some prompts that will be useful in your guiding your reflective practice. So just like I suppose any aspect of your preparation for Gaelic games, we can improve it by consistent practice. In the same way, reflection is like a skill that we can improve with practice. The prompts are certainly useful. We absolutely don't recommend that you need to use all of them. We've just given a variety here, and the idea or hope would be that maybe you could take one that might resonate with you and one kind of prompt that you could use in your own practice. These type of prompts have certainly helped us to be more focused, and then if we're more focused in our reflection, this in turn helps to ensure how the reflection improves our coaching practice, that it actually impacts on what we're doing. So some simple reflective prompts many of you are familiar with, like the what went well, what can I improve on, or also using a starter sentence like in the next session I will. This really helps us to identify actions that come from our reflections, and this is really important to make our coaching reflection practical. You can also use the what, so what, now what trilogy as a useful approach. This kind of helps to structure how you might focus on something that happened in the past. So to identify what happened, the impact of it, and what your next steps will be. So for example, in my instance, the what one time was I noticed that when I was asking questions, it was very hard to get response from the players sometimes. So the so what there was, well, if I was trying to be a player-centered coach, I need to engage players in a better, more meaningful discussion. So then in terms of now what I need to do next would be to plan my questioning, perhaps by starting with more simple questions and work towards more complex ideas like negotiating tactics or strategies, for example, with the players. And Richard is going to talk a little bit more about how we can plan and structure our questions a little later on. Another example of the what, so what, now what kind of approach to reflection, even for example with underage coaching, might be the what could be that I observe that a lot of time is wasted when the players are going on a water break, particularly if you have young underage and they're taking off helmets and putting them on. And the so what there is that we're actually losing a lot of our valuable time in the training session. So then our now what could be, rather than just leaving it as free time, we can ensure that we've a specific timed water break. A countdown timer may help the smaller underage teams return to the next phase of the session quickly, or maybe with an older team we could pose a tactical question or give them something to actually discuss about, so that chit chat during the water break becomes a bit more fruitful than just chatting about the social events. And again, when we're thinking of reflection, it's important to acknowledge that with human nature, it can often lead us to dwell more so on our mistakes or our areas of weakness or missed opportunities. So it's really important or can be helpful to improve a prompt like a standout coaching moment for me this week was. And this can help us to recognise and to acknowledge aspects of our coaching that are working well, because there are things that everybody does well. And reflecting on coaching approaches that work well and positive coaching moments can help us to understand why something worked well, and thus bring these positive elements kind of further into our coaching and into our practice. The process of kind of a shared reflection that we did was useful for both of us, and because we were coaching together, it was nice that we had the chance to observe each other's coaching practice as well, and this of course gave further opportunities to learn and give feedback and advice to each other. So for example, again, as I may be observing Richard coaching in a small-sided game, you know, I noticed how his coaching was more giving prompts or cues, asking questions to try develop players' spatial awareness or their awareness of support play, support play, as opposed to giving direct instruction to the players. So as a novice coach, observing a coach like that, this was very helpful in helping me to learn more as a coach as well.
So we'll move on from there and thinking about how we might take player feedback or how we might structure player feedback. And some of the things we did over the course of the last few years were things like using sticky notes. So when we were able to use dressing rooms freely pre-COVID, and maybe pose a question at the end of training session, have some sticky notes and biros available in the dressing room, and ask players to answer that question, which they could do anonymously, or they could put their name to it, stick them on the wall, and after training we would gather them and use those as some feedback. So we might have asked them to pick out something you really liked about tonight's training session, or pick out something you think didn't work so well that we shouldn't do again. So using kind of sticky notes like that or post-its to get some feedback. At a younger age group, it might be simply coming off the field at the end and doing a strategy like thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs across to get some feedback from the players in maybe under 12s, under 14s coming off the field to give you a quick snapshot of how they felt the session had gone, and then maybe act on some of that by maybe asking some further questions later. I suppose to be aware that how you decide to ask for feedback is important. So sometimes we found that if we asked for feedback in a whole group, it was actually quite difficult to get answers back. Sometimes, particularly in the college setting where we were coaching, where players are only there for a relatively short length of time, maybe 3 or 4 years, and you have a constant new batch of players coming in who may not know each other very well. And sometimes in that situation, players weren't comfortable giving feedback in front of the whole group. So then maybe having some anonymized format. So something I'm now using with an adult club team is using Google Forms as to distribute some questions and get some feedback either anonymously or otherwise, depending on what I want to use the feedback for. And players seem to be much more readily able to do that. In contrast, we tried to use WhatsApp groups for a while, and there was quite a little feedback coming back, because again, I don't think players wanted to be completely honest maybe in front of their peers. So thinking about how you structure that feedback can be important, and then using that feedback to change what you're doing, I think is an important part of that. Just to give you one particular example of how we used feedback, but possibly not early enough, was in one of the seasons, Anne and myself had decided we would do a really nice, what we thought was a really good structured warm-up that we were going to use at the start of every session, that we could then use as our structured warm-up on match days. So we thought we were being really player-centered by doing this, by having a warm-up that everybody knew and they could practice and got familiar with, and we did that repeatedly for a number of weeks until we got some feedback from the players. And the feedback to us was they absolutely hated it. They even said to us, could you not think of something new to do during the warm-up? Because for them, it was repetitive, it was boring, it was the same old thing at the start of every session. So we got that feedback from them and changed. Looking back on it, we probably should have looked for that feedback earlier, or perhaps explained better to the players why we were doing this. And then maybe see, would there have been better buy-in or better acceptance of it as a practice. But I suppose a point stems from that then is, if we do ask for feedback, and the green bubble up on the top corner there is, are we as coaches ready to accept that feedback? So sometimes it might not be something we want to hear. So are we willing and able to take that in a non-personalized way, but as something that improves ourselves, improves our players, improves the whole team, and accept the feedback and make changes accordingly.
Okay, and then just looking at, before we wrap up this section, just on our coach reflection and share more about our player-centered coaching, there's just some key points that we've learned from our shared coaching reflection together. It's important, you know, rather than viewing coach reflection as another thing that the coach has to do, you know, you may look at it as your commitment to your own continuous development as a coach. And to avoid reflection feeling like an onerous task, you could begin by choosing just one aspect of your own coaching that you would like to improve. And for us, this was player-centered coaching, and we'll explain why in a moment. And in terms of coach reflection, it's important that our reflection should be focused on our coaching and not the players. Very often our reflection as coaches justifiably focuses on the team and our individual players or their performance or their development. However, it's important that we extrapolate from the players' performance and development to better understand our coaching practice and how that has an impact. So it might be worth asking yourself this question, for example: what are you doing about your coaching actions in response to what you observe about your players? So for example, if we think, I might observe that the players are bunching all of the time in the games. So as a coach, I'm continually asking them to spread out, use the space, etc. But through reflection, I might think, what can I do to change my coaching actions to help the players better understand the use of space? So for example, it might be setting up a small-sided game, using cones to create zones, so players can actually see different space on the wing or understand the importance of switching the play, etc. So looking at what you're doing about your own coaching actions in response to what you observe about your players. Again, really, if we think of reflection as we might think of physical fitness, we cannot just work on our fitness in, you know, a standalone pre-season block. You know, instead our strength and conditioning evolves and it needs to continue throughout the season, and the demands change throughout the season. So in the same way, our need to reflect, it needs to be sustained and maintained throughout the season with a consistent approach, be it on your own or with a partner or in whatever kind of way suits you best. So just going back to earlier in your notebook, if you did, I was just asked you to reflect on how, or to make note on how have you reflected on your own coaching practice in the past. So perhaps you have already noted that, but maybe just following our discussion now, there might be something else that you might like to add to your own reflective practice in the coming season, given that we're just returning to playing coaching again at the moment.
Okay, and while you're jotting down something there, that's something you would add to your practice over the coming weeks, and we're going to move on to the second section of tonight's talk, where we're going to focus on being player-centered, because we've talked about it a little bit so far in that this is what we wanted to reflect on. And I suppose the term player-centered or athlete-centered, as it's used in these two books that I have on the screen here, it comes up in a lot of coaching conversations. It's in the Gaelic Games pathway document, front and center. So the research and the writing on it, which very often has come from writers like Lynn Kidman or Shane Pill, coming from an Australian and a New Zealand background. Player-centered coaching very often talks about looking at player decision making. It looks at things like using questions and discussion a lot in your coaching. It talks about player empowerment. The aspect of coach-player relationships is really important, and it very often talks about developing a good culture. So some of those seem to be straightforward, like asking questions and getting discussions, or using a games-based approach. Others might seem a little bit more fluffy or hard to pin down, things like culture and empowerment. And more often than not, we hear of team culture being described with really successful teams. So maybe currently Limerick hurlers or Dublin footballers would often be described as teams with a strong culture. Okay, so often it's the successful teams we hear about, or the All Blacks culture, and everybody started cleaning up dressing rooms as a result of what the All Blacks sweeping the shed idea. But it's important that, yes, we can learn from those really strong cultures, but we might also need to think about how it applies in our own coaching context. And player-centered coaching, I think, is not about just simply importing somebody else's culture, but it's taking ideas, looking at your own coaching, maybe reflecting and building a culture with your players and with others in your club or in your team that suits your players and your settings. So things like building belonging. So for a team, it might be coming to training where everybody wears the same t-shirt, training top, coming to training and building up a sense of belonging. That might be something that some clubs would buy into, or some teams. But thinking about more generally, the actions that you do, are they impacting the players positively on and off the field? So you as a coach are coaching the person rather than the sport, and seeing how that might guide the way you help to build a culture within the team you're coaching. Or for players, how you might contribute as well in the way you interact with other coaches, or sorry, other players, and with the coaches. So we were intrigued by this idea of being player-centered. So we tried to see, could we put it into practice in our coaching. And I think for us, it was a challenge to coach differently, or to do different things within our coaching. At one point, our discussion around player-centered coaching led us to the analogy of a roller coaster. There were lots of ups and downs as we experienced things that worked and didn't work. For me, for example, there was a feeling in the reflections I wrote of not being in control. I felt that in what we were trying to do, we were giving some responsibility to players, just like the player-centered model suggests, but I found that quite uncomfortable as a coach, because I was changing practices that I probably had ingrained for years and years before that. So it may entail some changes in your practice, and it may entail that sense of being uncomfortable. And on that note, I noticed last week in the Camogie Association coaching magazine that was published, Brian Boyle wrote a really interesting article, and he used the phrase "troubling the comfortable." That certainly made sense to us when we read it. That idea of, we're comfortable in things we've done maybe for years on the coaching field, and maybe there's a sense that we need to trouble the comfortable. And in our shared reflections, I think, and talking to each other and talking to other people helped us, in contrast, to comfort the troubles. So things we're having difficulty with, our shared reflection helped to help us to work through those as we face the different dilemmas that were in place in our coaching.
And then just to look at the questioning and discussion, which was one key element of player-centered coaching. When we think about our questioning as coaches, we need to think about when we ask questions, how we ask, and who we ask. And basically, in short, good questions will lead to good answers. So planning questions can help our players to be more comfortable answering and engaging in a more meaningful discussion. So perhaps as coaches, many of you may be able to relate to asking a question to a group of players, and very often than not receiving a rather surface level or a vague response. So preparing our questions as we would any other aspect of our training session can really facilitate better player learning and better meaningful discussion. So we can ask questions in real time. So for example, during a training session, this can be effective. You know, we can pause and ask questions, but also can sometimes disrupt the flow of a session. Last year, or in the previous year when we were coaching together, when the games were actually running, we used a strategy of involving our subs and asking them questions during our real games. So for example, rather than having the subs sitting idly on the sideline or chatting about something else, you know, we would take that time to pose questions to the subs, observing the opposition play, observing how our plan, tactics or strategies were playing out in real time. This certainly helped the subs to be more focused on the game, and then therefore obviously better ready to be introduced when they were needed. This then also helped us that at half time to give a bit more ownership or discussion to the players. So we break the team into groups of maybe 3 or 4 and have one sub with each 3 or 4 players that had been involved in the action. And it's nice then to see the mixture of the perspective from the sideline and the perspective of players that were involved in the middle of the action. Very often it's easier to be more analytical from the sideline, and also you can have a different perspective when you're in the middle of the field. So this certainly helped to kind of structure the player discussion in a meaningful way. Also, as Richard mentioned earlier, our use of the WhatsApp group for player feedback wasn't very useful at times. While we used it for communicating about training and organisational issues, it worked well. But at times, perhaps after a game, we might pose a question to reflect on our performance, or to pose ideas about new strategies that we could use, or to get ideas from players. These messages that may have come from Richard or myself were often just like tumbleweeds in the WhatsApp group chat. Very rarely replied to, or they very rarely actually stimulated a discussion with the players. We found that in contrast, chatting to the players just in small groups, one-to-one, or with 2 or 3 of them, maybe during a meal after a game or on a bus journey to a game, that these times the players were probably more comfortable. They had more reasonable time to actually think more meaningfully about, the playing and the performance of the team. And those types of discussions were much more fruitful and meaningful.
And then if we look at how you might do it, and I'm just going to go through a number of different strategies of how we would promote questioning and discussion. So many of you are familiar with seeing large tactic boards being used on the sideline or in dressing rooms to scaffold players' discussions. We saw it a lot during water breaks set into county matches last year, and that might be one option. Another option to take that idea a step further would be to use smaller kind of A4 sized whiteboards. Any of you who have a teaching background may be familiar with these. I'm not sure is there a formal name for them. We call them show me boards. So that you can maybe distribute these, as Anne mentioned earlier on, at a water break, give a task to a small group, work out something, a tactic on the small board, and use that as a discussion point to get people talking about maybe a particular tactic, or to respond to a question that we'd asked. So you might give it to your goalkeeper and your backs to think about, let's work on the next kick out that happens after this break when we get back into our training game. So that's something that might work. Another idea might be use the idea of think, pair, share. Put players into a small group, give them a prompt, ask them to think about it for 2 or 3 minutes, and then share it back within their group first, and then back to everybody else. So discussing it in a small group can be much less threatening for a player than if they are asked and pinpointed to speak among the whole group. So that might be another strategy, or something like 2 stars in the wish for younger teams, where you identify 2 things that are going well, or 2 things you're doing well, and 1 wish, 1 thing we'd like to improve. So I think all those things help to ingrain questioning and discussion throughout your session. So you might think about then the kind of questions we ask. And I'm going to use the phrase here, fat and skinny questions. So a skinny question is one that maybe gives a simple yes/no answer, like, what day is it today? We'd hope the answer to that is Tuesday if we're listening to this live. So that would be a skinny question. There's really only one answer to it. Skinny questions have their place, maybe to establish facts, but they don't really work to get discussion going. A fat question, in contrast, is more open-ended, and it gives a number of different options. So we might ask a fat question like, what might happen if we brought the corner forward out to midfield for the next 10 minutes of a game? So then there's a whole range of answers that could come from that question. So think about how you ask questions. Are they open-ended with lots of possibilities, or are they more narrow, which just give yes/no answers and probably stifle discussion? So to make the discussions more meaningful, then maybe teasing out an idea that helps to get people talking, get people discussing, very often in small groups, to come up with a solution to a task or a question that you pose for them. So planning those questions and see which ones will get this discussion going, as opposed to the ones that kill discussion and don't get very far.
And also, as a coach, in terms of questioning, you may be cognizant of, when we pose questions, like very often it may be a lot of the same players that answer the question. And it's important that we think of using some of the strategies Richard has outlined there in helping to ensure that more voices are heard. So for example, it might be alerting a player beforehand, like, Anne, what do you think of in posing the question? So that player then has time to think about the answer and not feel as nervous or put on the spot in front of the whole team. Again, giving players time to think certainly helps to get more of the authentic, meaningful answers rather than your typical service level one-word answers. It is really nice to give players an opportunity to answer questions in groups. So for example, have all of your defenders working together. Could you work together with the goalkeeper on a kick-out strategy like Richard had said? Or, you know, this type of group work can sometimes be more feasible if you think of an inter-county setup where you have a defence coach and a forwards coach and players may be working in groups. But again, we can also think how we could make this workable in small groups in our club settings also. The I Coach Kids website had a nice quote shared in it recently that great coaches don't have all the answers, but they ask great questions. So really that encompasses the importance of preparing your questions in addition to the other organisational aspects of your training session. So just as you wouldn't arrive to the pitch without your slitters or your footballs, you know, you're not going to begin a training session without having thought about and planned your questions beforehand. And finally, just before we move on from questioning and linking to our next piece, it's important to recognise that we want to invite our players to ask questions also. Like, questioning should be a two-way dialogue, so we should encourage our players to ask questions, and this in turn helps to develop empowerment. It opens more of a meaningful discussion with the coach. So we'll talk a little bit more about establishing that communication with the coach and kind of giving that sense of empowerment to the players in our next slide. So in the green speech bubble here, you can see some feedback that we received from our players. Again, it would be easier if you just told us what to do. And in a sense, this kind of captures in our efforts to coach in a player-centred way. There was a sense amongst the players at times that it would be easier if we as the coaches just told them what to do. And again, we have to acknowledge that some players weren't used to being asked questions at training. And if this was the case, they may have felt uncomfortable with this type of player-centred coaching. So for example, we used a lot of games-based approach in our player-centred coaching. And when we didn't have a clear explanation or rationale discussed with the players, many of the players didn't recognise how the small-sided games helped to develop their fitness, how it improved their skills, how it improved their decision making. They didn't see the connection. So from experience, and again through gaining some feedback from the players, we learned that when we're using the small-sided games in our training, it was very helpful either beforehand or afterwards to have that discussion with the players. So to explicitly check their understanding that they can recognise how what we've practiced in the modified game situation could then be extended and applied in a real game scenario. So to see how keeping possession for such a length of time or switching play from one side to the other is actually transferable to a real game scenario. Just as is illustrated there on the balance on the slide, developing players' decision making, it takes time and it can be challenging. And we found that the players were often more receptive to taking responsibility and taking time to work on their decision making during a training session, perhaps because it wasn't as pressurized as a championship game. Very often in a game situation, they may resort to relying more so on direct instruction from the coach. So it's important to meet your players with where they're at as well and to scaffold them on that journey. So developing this shared approach to decision making closely relates to player empowerment, and in many senses we found it was difficult to find that balance between coach and player input and developing these both elements of player-centred coaching together.
And that brings us to think about how we help players to make decisions. So as Anne mentioned, we use a lot of small-sided games, so different scenarios, maybe an overload 5v4 or 6v4, a player down, a player up, so that we were creating situations like that players needed to think about how they would solve the problems within the game. So constraining what could happen in the game and develop their decision making within those kind of small-sided game ideas. One thing I would now say, having worked on many of these small-sided games for a while, is trying as much as possible in our Gaelic games practices to make them end-to-end games wherever possible, so that it mirrors the direction of play going from one side to the other, rather than just possession games that don't move out of one grid or one zone. So trying to build in that end-to-end aspect to it, which mirrors what happens in a real game and can then support the decisions that players will also make in a real game. And while we're planning specifically, we're also thinking about the coaching opportunities that might happen during the training session. So pausing the play perhaps at points in a training game to stop, review positions, ask a quick question or two. So then very quickly we get back into the game and players are thinking about a particular prompt that we might have given them. So using a strategy like that within games to stop briefly, maybe an action replay idea, and then move on again. So putting the players into situations, and this applies at all age groups and all levels, I think, where they have to make decisions for themselves. And then we were talking about player empowerment, which is probably one of those topics that's hard to actually quantify. So we tried to identify player leaders groups as one thing we thought might help player empowerment. And we tried to move beyond the kind of traditional captain, vice captain roles there, so that we had other roles for people who would do other things, maybe talking at halftime, maybe designing warm-ups, maybe doing some of the social aspects that are important for college teams. So trying to extend the leadership structure. We found though that unless we scaffolded that carefully, that it was actually difficult for our players sometimes to actually take on those leadership roles. And some of the feedback they gave us was that we were being a little bit too abstract, and that we needed to guide them a little bit more in what exactly they needed to do in those leadership roles. I think that's an important point to keep in mind if we are developing leadership roles, how we as coaches help or scaffold players to realize what they can do within those roles. So one specific example came back to us was maybe we would have said to our leaders to just make sure the players are focused for the championship match that's coming ahead. But the player said to us, well, it's very hard to keep saying, be focused. We need other ways of saying of working on that. So we try to vary the language we used rather than just be focused, to help them to come up with other ideas that we would spread in the smaller groups to make sure everybody was focused on maybe their specific tasks that they had to do. So those were some of the struggles we had around empowerment, and particularly around leadership. It takes a lot of work from a coach, and it takes a lot of work from the leaders who are selected to actually take on those tasks.
And just as we're coming close to the end of tonight's session, there are just 3 points here that we'd like to just reflect on again before we finish in terms of player-centered coaching. So to think about the importance of player feedback, think about talking to every player, communicating meaningfully with them, and understanding your own coaching context. And again, of course, recognizing that all settings have their own nuances and differences, and that we acknowledge that. Again, as sure a lot of us have attended a lot of these webinars over the last number of months, and a nice tip that we picked up from the Electric Ireland Game Changers webinar a few months ago was the idea that we could ask each player, what could you tell me about yourself that could help me to coach you better? And really this simple question could really be helpful in helping us to get a better understanding of our players, and then in doing so, helping us to improve our coaching in a player-centered way. So perhaps it may be that question itself, or it may be something else that we shared about player-centered coaching in the last while, that you may take one nugget that may be useful, that you might adapt or include in your coaching in this coming season. Maybe on your notepad now you might want to jot down one thing that you might add to it. Earlier I asked you to think about the words that come to mind. Maybe it was some of the words that we've shared, or maybe there's something else that you include in your own player-centered coaching.
And as you are hopefully making a few notes there on that, I'm just going to put up some of the resources that we have found useful. I've mentioned Wade Gilbert earlier, and I think his Coaching Better Every Season book is really excellent in terms of developing coach reflection, but developing your planning in general. And Doug Lemov's book, The Coach's Guide to Teaching, really brings together lots of the aspects of good teaching and good coaching that are shared. And I suppose closer to home, we'd be very much influenced by some of what's happening on Twitter over the last while. Colm Nally's resources are excellent. The at GAA Sense Twitter feed with lots of small-sided games and conditioned games that I think for us really fit into the games-based approach that's part of being player-centered. And Philip Kerr's player Gaelic Twitter feed as well is one that we would come back to guide us and to keep us questioning what we're doing and to keep adjusting our practice. So then just some final thoughts then as I wrap up from my end. I have a quote from John Wooden up there. John Wooden's basketball quotes are often appear in so many different situations, but I think this one is quite useful and quite interesting in the context of what we're doing tonight. And Wooden said, if you spend too much time learning the tricks of the trade, you may not learn the trade. And I suppose for all of us, we've been at so many webinars for the past year and have accumulated pages and pages of notes and ideas. But all those ideas, and even maybe some of the ideas we've touched on tonight, still need to be adapted and adjusted for your own coaching contexts. So we might pick up a nugget, think about it, and see can we use that in our own contexts as we learn our trade of being coaches. So each of us needs to reflect on what works for us and for the teams we coach. And being player-centered can be challenging, especially as we coach a panel of players all coming from maybe different ages, different individual strengths and needs. And we have to try and, as much as possible, make it fit all the different player needs that are coming towards us, different levels of confidence and development. And that's a major challenge for a coach, particularly if you have a large panel of players and you're trying to work to develop each and every one of them. So I suppose the diagram on the left-hand side just helps us to think about balancing the needs of the coach, what you want to achieve yourself as a coach, balancing that with the needs of the players and where they're coming from, and trying to put all those together to the kind of sweet spot that's in the middle, where we're also doing all of that for the betterment of the team. So we're conscious that we've skimmed over a lot of topics tonight and appreciate many of the ideas would need much further discussion. But we hope you've got some food for thought from that, and that if you go away from this reflecting on your own practices a little bit more and asking more questions, then I think we'll be happy from our end that we've achieved something over the past 45 or 50 minutes. So thank you all for your attention.
Gee, thank you very much, Richard and Anne, for a very insightful presentation. A lot of learning points there. I have about 2 or 3 pages written here, so I'm looking forward to getting back in the field next week coaching again. But Joe, anybody here tonight, if you have any questions for Anne or Richard, please guys just put them in the Q&A and we'll pose them to Richard and Anne. But while people are probably putting in 1 or 2 questions, Richard, you don't mind me, just something that came into my head, and I'd love to pose to yourself and Anne. I suppose now of all your learning, what have you learned about your own coaching, or how has it evolved over the past number of years as a result of this practice? And Richard, I'd love to just, I'd love to kind of hear that. How has it evolved as a result of all this learning?
Okay, if I take that, I think Anne's screen looks as if it's frozen there for a minute.
Yeah, thanks.
So I suppose, William, for me, and I'm coaching, I suppose, 24 or 5 years at this stage, and I think I've changed a lot in that I suppose when I started out, I might have thought that I could control everything, that I knew everything, that it was all about me. But the more I coach, I think the more questions I ask of myself, and maybe I think the less I know now than I did maybe 20 years ago. But it's kind of the collaboration, particularly working with somebody else, is really key to sharing ideas, bouncing ideas, experimenting with new strategies. And if to use the analogy maybe of PlayStation, I'm not a PlayStation player with the controller in my hand on the sideline. I need to step back, enable players to make decisions. And so it's a much more democratic process now than I think I would have thought about when I started out coaching. So for me, that would be the biggest change.
Very good. I know, Anne, your screen's probably frozen, but I know we can hear you. So, Anne, if you'd like to just answer that question as well before we move on.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, what I've learned over the past number of years, I suppose, as a novice coach working with Richard and also from a player's perspective, I've certainly gained a great appreciation for the complexity of coaching. You know, really a coach has a responsibility for developing a player's physical skills, but also, you know, no matter what sport it is, there's lots of other non-tangible aspects to a player's development that, you know, a coach needs to be aware of. So it certainly is a complex role. And I suppose, reflecting on my experience again as a player and working with different coaches, that, you know, how a coach makes you feel is probably just as important, if not more important, than what the coach does. You know, a coach that can instill confidence and belief in a player, that really helps to kind of create the foundations of, you know, a really nice team culture and help, you know, each player and individual, and I suppose the team then eventually, you know, to flourish or to kind of perform at their best. So it certainly is complex, but, you know, it's nice when it comes together.
Well said, well said. Okay, look, one question before I go to Des, and is just self-reflection. You know, how do we embed that culture into our club, or is it an individually led phenomenon, or is it so? How do we embed in culture of self-reflection in a club sense? I know there's probably a lot of coaches listening here tonight goes, you know, I'm into this. You know, how is it individual, Richard, or how do we embed it? How do we kind of start to embed it in our club, whereby we kind of take away this fear of people looking over our shoulder, shall I say, and start those coaching conversations? Richard, I'll just pose that to you before we finish up.
I think it's a really good question, William, because if I look back again over the last number of years, at one stage, I think coaches almost clung to their own ideas and beliefs and wouldn't share anything. I think there's a much greater, I think, culture of sharing, to describe it like that, of people willing to learn from each other. And William, you know yourself, Irene Hogan is from CIT, is working on a really interesting project with the LGFA at the moment on developing a community of practice within clubs, where club coaches just talk to each other regularly. So it may be the coaches at the under 12 age group or the under 8 age group, or it may be coaches in the club generally, and they begin to have regular meetings together. I think Zoom and Teams has made that much easier. You can have a half an hour discussion with your coaches in the club, and I think sharing ideas, learning new things. I think that's a really useful way for clubs to start off. And I know there are lots of clubs probably doing that, but for clubs who are not doing it, just support clubs to talk, our coaches, particularly newer coaches, to talk to other people, to bounce ideas off them, and to get some feedback about their coaching.
Yeah, and I liked your kind of, you know, ask for it and accept it. So, you know what, if you want to get better, if you want to improve, ask for feedback, accept what comes. Even if it's not so good, you're going to learn as a result of the same. So, Richard and Anne, thank you very much for the presentation tonight. Very insightful. I hope the coaches here tonight really, really enjoyed it. I took loads of notes. I'm sure people listening at home took loads of notes as well. So we're going to move on to Des Ryan, who is our lead in the athletic development work group. And Des, tell us what's going to be happening in the Be Ready to Play program over the coming weeks. What are we looking forward to?
Yeah, sure. There's lots going on. So, well, first of all, Richard and Anne, great content that's so important. It really accelerates development for player and coach. You had me, I just finished a session there with under 12s. I was reflecting. I went out with not as detailed a plan as I usually do. I had 3 activities. I spent way too much time on the first and second activity, ran out of time for the third. My reflection is I got to do that plan in the coming sessions. So simple thing to do, and it just accelerates all of us in our development. So great topic. Thanks very much for that. So yeah, the Be Ready to Play tomorrow, block 5 is released on the website of the Athletic Development Programme. The youth content is done in the context of training has started. It's designed the stability, mobility, speed, agility, strength, power, endurance to be integrated into the training. A little bit of less of the strength and power, a little bit more of integrating the other topics into the game. So built to fit in the new context, the new situation. Whereas the adult program, still individual training, that's still designed around the constraints of individual training. So 2 weeks of content there, ready to go, ready to watch. And in terms of webinars, we've got an excellent webinar provided by UPMC. They made a great connection for us with John Norwick, from the Pittsburgh Steelers. A really experienced guy. I had the pleasure of chatting to him a couple of weeks ago. He's been in the industry so long. He's so much to share. So I'd really advise going there, and we'll get some advice from the NFL on being ready to play. And John will particularly focus on muscle injuries and hamstrings. And finally, myself and Mick Dempsey did a quick 20-minute webinar on returning to training. This phase we're in now, going from restricted movement to training, going from individual training to team training, non-contact. So there's 11 tips. It's easy to follow. There's a 2-page document to go with it, and again, that's on the Be Ready to Play website. So plenty of content for people there to use.
Loads of stuff. There's loads of stuff, and we hope everybody are enjoying it. Massive registration numbers with the Be Ready to Play days, which is fantastic to see, and hopefully it's going to help people not only just up to now, but over the coming weeks and months as well. Des, so it's fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to the up and coming sports science webinar with John Norwicks, and also we have a coaching webinar. Developing the coaching eye and how to develop a skill with Colin Nally and Martin Forty coming up as well at the end of May. So really looking forward to that as well. So again, on that note, the Be Ready to Play, that's it for us from another session of the coaching webinar in partnership with UPMC. We had Richard Bowles on tonight with And the Wire, focusing on self-reflection, how to be a player-centered coach. We hope you really enjoyed the session this evening, and we're looking forward to seeing you all back in our next webinar, which is with John Norwick over the coming weeks. So on that note, good evening everybody, and we hope you enjoy your going back to play over the coming weeks. Thank you.